which kicked off about 2 years ago, and we are now moving steadily towards the launch of version 1.0 of this framework in the next few months. So I'd like to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the objectives and goals of this initiative, as well as who we're working with and how we're working, and some other ways to get involved if you're interested. So I know that you've been talking already today quite a bit about deforestation and the challenges of deforestation that we're all facing globally, as well as some very concrete ways it seems that those in Sweden can address these issues. And so the accountability framework is really building on the work of many other initiatives and collaborating with them to look at the issue of deforestation in commodity supply chains. So the initiative is largely a response to a call and a request from companies to have greater clarity and messaging from civil society around what is expected in terms of scope and implementation of the commitments that they've made. And just so to frame this a little bit better, I want to show you over the next few slides some graphics that you may be very familiar with because they're from many of our partners we're working with, such as climate focus and supply change. But we know that there is an increasing number of commitments made by private companies to eliminate deforestation and human exploitation from their commodity supply chains. So much so that over the past 5 to 6 years, we've seen an increase leading up to almost 500 companies and almost 800 different commitments that have been made across various supply chains, but especially those forest risk supply chains of palm oil, pulp, paper, and timber, soy, and cattle. In particular. However, we do know that there's a very wide implementation gap at the moment. So a lot of the interim milestones that were set for these commitments, many of which had a target date of 2020, have not been met. We know that the definitions and standards and tools, while there are many and many excellent efforts in this area, are not harmonized. And so there's a real lack of clarity around implementation. And this limits also the ability to monitor and effectively report on progress towards commitments by companies. But there's also then a lack of common metrics to track this progress and performance amongst those of us in civil society and other initiatives that work on assessment. And so, for example, these metrics can limit accountability. They can really also hinder and limit a clear message that we're sending to companies in terms of what good looks like in terms of implementation and commitments and what best practices. So, for example, we have various scorecard systems and assessment systems out there. The example you see on the screen here is looking at a large international company that's sourcing palm oil and the way they are being rated by 2 different scorecards that are out there now. We've hidden the names for anonymity here, but for example, a company may receive a high rating from one scorecard and a low rating from another, being evaluated on the same behaviors. And so this does create a certain amount of confusion and a lack of clarity in terms of how to really move forward in practical terms and implement commitments and credibly demonstrate progress towards them. And so that leaves us where we are today, where I know you've been talking a lot about these issues of deforestation, human rights violations, which do persist in these supply chains. It results in continued material risk for companies, which is very serious in terms of not only their material and financial risk, but reputational risk, of course, as well. And overall, we have still much ambiguity about progress and outcomes, and it allows for a certain amount of greenwashing potentially and lack of accountability overall. So the Accountability Framework Initiative was brought together really in a collaborative effort to reach consensus around what the scope and implementation, monitoring, and reporting against commitments can look like to accelerate progress and improve accountability in this space. And so the framework itself is really a set of common definitions and norms and guidance that we brought together, that we have built through a consensus-based process with our steering group members, I'll show you in a minute, to bring this greater clarity and consistency and effectiveness to implementation. The framework specifically will help companies to fulfill their commitments and is also a tool for other actors by clarifying good practices. So we provided the critical details around setting implementation, monitoring, verification, and reporting of supply chain commitments. We're clarifying and working with the many other standards and tools and systems that are in this space and that are active to fulfill supply chain commitments. So to be clear, the framework itself is not a new tool, nor is it looking to supersede any of the existing initiatives, but rather it's looking to create that harmonization and alignment amongst all these tools and systems so that companies know and are clear on which ones to use to meet their specific commitment for their supply chains. And where we've seen there are any critical gaps in these areas, we have worked together to reach consensus amongst our steering group members and to bring clarity to fill those critical gaps in topics and content where those are currently lacking. And all of that leading to help improve the level of consensus and alignment around ethical supply chains, especially between those of us in civil society and with NGOs. So now to move forward a little bit, what is the initiative and what is it not? Because clearly there are a lot of tools and standards out there, and we want to be very clear that this is a public good. It is something that we're developing amongst the members of our steering committee with a lot of inputs from many other actors and from consultations throughout the different tropical producing regions in the world. We're providing clear norms and guidance, but it is a framework, and it is intended to provide guidance. It is not another standard. So it's working to align monitoring, reporting, and assessment initiatives and tools. So to help those tools as well that companies are using to report on their progress to be clear and consistent with common definitions and metrics. It's not a commercial product or service. It's not a new certification program. So in the sense that it is a standard, it can be used to conduct, for companies to conduct their own assessments or ratings and to benchmark their performance. So it's intended to be used as a tool for companies when they're setting their commitments, when they're designing their implementation systems, either themselves or with their different service providers, and as a tool for them to benchmark their progress. In terms of scope, the scope of the accountability framework largely mirrors the scope of the commitments that have been taken by many companies. So we're looking at deforestation and protection of other natural ecosystems. This includes conversion of non-forest ecosystems, respect for human rights, including labor rights, and support for producer and community livelihoods. In terms of a beginning scope, at least, we are looking at the major drivers of deforestation worldwide, especially in tropical ecosystems, so palm oil, soy, cattle, the others that you see here in the middle column. And then we are looking at these commodities across all of the different geographies that you see in the right-hand column. So beginning with South America, Southeast Asia, and West and Central Africa. But the accountability framework would be applicable, of course, to other regions in the world as well. And the scope of this scope really maps out through the framework through a sort of ethical supply chain journey where we set this scope for companies to be able to follow as they're setting their commitments, either developing new commitments or refreshing their current commitments. It provides the guidance they need when they're looking at taking action, looking at implementation, monitoring and verification, and then also provides guidance around reporting and disclosure when they're looking to demonstrate progress. So now to who is involved and who's behind this initiative. It's led by a coalition of partners, Rainforest Alliance also being one of the steering group members. And as I mentioned, we host the backbone team of the initiative in collaboration with the Meridian Institute. We have two labor rights groups who joined us about 6 months ago, Social Accountability International and Verité, and with them we're working to build out the guidance around workers' rights in the framework. We have two independent experts from Indonesia and Liberia, and we have other NGOs as well from Ghana and Brazil who are part of the coalition in addition to these larger global partners. And as we've been building the framework over the past year and a half, we have had over 30 organizations who work on different aspects related to supply chain and deforestation and human rights who have been contributing to the content of the framework. In addition, and we've been aligning and collaborating with many, many other key initiatives who are critical in this space. So, for example, we've been working with and we've ensured that the accountability framework's guidance is aligned with the high carbon stock approach and the high conservation value methodology. We're working with the Collaboration for Forest and Agriculture, which is an initiative looking at soy and cattle supply chains in Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. And they're developing very similar guidance that will be part of the accountability framework. We're working with different national and regional approaches, such as the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, the Africa Palm Oil Initiative. We're beginning some work as well in Colombia recently. And we're working, especially very importantly, across the different reporting and assessment initiatives. You may have seen that CDP's new forest methodology questionnaire that was released earlier this week references and is aligned with the different norms and metrics that the accountability framework has developed. So we've been working very closely with all of these partners and many others, Forest 500, Global Canopy, Global Forest Watch, Spot, over the past year to ensure this alignment and to make sure that that these different reporting and assessment initiatives initiatives are harmonized and therefore that there can be increased clarity in this space overall in terms of seeing progress towards these commitments. And then we're working with some of the responsible investment initiatives as well, and increasingly looking at ways to engage the financial institutions in that sector. And of course, also aligning with different certification systems, including Rainforest Alliances, but also RSPO, FSC, and others, and working closely with ICL Alliance in this. And then finally, we have a process where we are working on creation of the content of the framework, consultation of the framework with different partners across the different tropical producing regions we're focused on. And there has been an ongoing engagement and conversation with many in the private sector throughout this process as well. So we have launched a consultation period that has been running over the past 60 days or so, and it's just wrapping up now. We had the first full draft of the framework released in December, and we intend to now revise this over the next 2 months and to launch the version 1.0 of the framework on an online platform that will build from our existing website in June. So please stay tuned for that. You can also go to our website and subscribe for our newsletters. You can follow us on Twitter as well. And of course, we welcome any other questions or inquiries or collaborations that you may be interested in as well. I will stop there and see if there's any time for questions, and you are welcome through our website or through my email to reach out at any point as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. We have time for a short question from the audience, if there is one, before moving on. Yeah. There seems to be no urgent questions, at least. Feel free to also contact Adrienne or talk to Marcus Schäfer, who's the local representative for Rainforest Alliance, who will be with us in the afternoon as well. Probably can answer some of your questions. Thank you very much, and again, Adrienne, and maybe a round of applause as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much again for this opportunity, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your meetings today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So next up is Myron Bastos Lima, postdoc at Chalmers, and also heavily involved in the work that Trace is doing here at Stockholm Environment Institute. So Myron, the floor will be yours soon.
The floor is already mine.
The floor is yours. Soon the screen will be as well.
So thank you all again for coming to our event. It's very good to be able to present on this topic. It's the first presentation actually that I give after having done some field work in Brazil at the end of last year after we had our elections. So, and as you can see, I have this very modest, unambitious topic coverage to go through in 10 minutes. But the idea obviously is not to exhaust any of those topics, but rather to give a more horizontal presentation showing to you how these different elements belong to a bigger picture. And of course, it has to start with this, since Insights from Brazil is one of the points I've been invited to talk about. I mean, the most critical factor on the ground there has been the election results and the start on the 1st of January of an administration that was elected on a very aggressive anti-conservation campaign. I would even go as far as arguing that we wouldn't even have an environment ministry if it weren't for European screaming at the end of last year. That eventually filtered to the ears of that gentleman. Our Minister of Environment was actually the last one to be appointed, and up to the last minute we didn't know if we would have one or not. And what has started to happen is we all know that Brazil had become a success story of the efforts to tackle deforestation. And that was perhaps best represented by what's abbreviated as PPCDAM, which is the Plan for Protection and for Prevention and Combating Deforestation of the Amazon that started in 2004. And with domestic and foreign economic assistance, it started improving enforcement, monitoring capabilities, actions on the ground, and a lot of that is starting to be watered down. I mean, now, from this past 2 months, we've had the laxest in terms of actions from the environmental authorities has been the weakest start since '95, and that's not in vain. I mean, they're cutting personnel, and now there is a gag order on public servants from the environmental authorities, meaning that since I think 2 weeks ago, they're no longer authorized to speak to the media without going through the politically appointed people in the ministry anymore, and so forth. Another major move has been to merge, or pretty much make it disappear, the Indigenous Peoples Agency into the Ministry of Agriculture, which is curious if you read the news about it, because even the agribusiness lobbyists were surprised. They're like, yeah, we were expecting some, that perhaps it would be relocated somewhere, but this has been too good to be true. In the Ministry of Agriculture, wow, you laugh because it's a bit tragicomic. And now there is on the table this idea of a conciliation council that would actually approve or not environmental violations detected on the ground. And of course, that would be composed by a multi-ministerial body that would be, friendly enough to perhaps revise some of the environmental fines. So that's more or less the context, and we have to be very sober about it. Meanwhile, if we are to look at the numbers beyond the political context, this is what started to happen. This is from the latest annual report of that program that I mentioned before. These are the level of deforestation, the actual of the Amazon, and where we should be according to our own climate policy in Brazil, where we need to be by 2020. And if you see, it was like a walk in the park up to here. And then we had the impeachment here, and agribusiness became much stronger. And in 2018, it was the first time that it actually started to creep back up beyond our targets. So what appeared to be so easy now risks becoming a failure. That's, again, the status. That's where we are. So now starting my tour of topics. Land rights is an important one that often gets forgotten. I mean, not the least because here in Europe, the debate is dominated by downstream players who are more involved in market relations with the actors on the ground there than with public policy. And land policy is particularly complicated, I think, anywhere, especially if it's not your country. It easily becomes mind-boggling. And by no means I'm going to exhaust Brazilian land policy here, but one thing I find very important to highlight is the role of indigenous people, and I'm glad that this has been brought up this morning. But just to add some numbers to it, about a third of the Amazon carbon stocks within Brazil are within indigenous lands. They're about 14% of the whole country. A lot of the Amazon is in it. Therefore, the greedy eyes of those who are interested in continuing land use change, because of course, I mean, do not kid yourselves into thinking that there are no powerful interests behind such powerful drivers. And their eyes are already shining into gobbling up those lands. There's been some precedent of that, of attempts. A few years before, there was a constitutional amendment project number 215. It still remains to be seen whether they'll try to resuscitate that one or to put a new one on the ground. That would basically reopen the discussion on all indigenous lands in Brazil, and Congress would have the power to ratify them or not. Which of course is very scary given that we have, I think now, for the first time in history in Brazil, one indigenous person as an MP. And you may guess how many agribusiness representatives are there. They're the most overrepresented sector in Brazil when it comes to the parliament. And one of the things they want to do, so that you become aware of this, is to do what has been happening with other traditional populations in the country. Because the indigenous peoples enjoy quite a lot of soft power in terms of support around the world. There are UN bodies, connected to supporting indigenous people around the world and so forth. Their legal rights are much stronger, But we have, for instance, traditional communities that come from former runaway slaves and that maintain some forms of African culture in there, the quilombolas. They're far more vulnerable if the idea that has been applied to take their lands has been to avoid collective land titles, but rather to give them individual land titles. And because these are poor people, they usually don't manage to do much with their land. Therefore comes a nice man to them like, hey, I give you a lot of money and you give me this land. You're not doing anything with it anyway. So why do you want it? You can move to the city. That's the place to be. You know, your kids want to move there anyway. Many of them are hoping to do that with indigenous people. And you can, I bet, you can expect over the coming 4 years, and I hope it will be only 4, a lot of lawfare on that topic. Anyway, I took more time on that because some of the other topics have already been covered in the previous presentations. For the past 10 to 15 years, we've been perhaps a bit fixated too much with certification. I think clearly there is some role to play there, but clearly it's not going to be sufficient to take us very far. When it comes to soy, for instance, it has never really taken off. It remains very small as a niche market. And we've had a mushrooming of different certifications that not only have shown to confuse consumers, but also are often weaker, and the demand has never really picked up sufficiently. So we may have to rethink this. Again, it's not to discard certification, but the need to go beyond it now, I think, is as clear as it gets. The zero deforestation commitments have been talked about. I'm really keen on finding out how come Sweden is not yet in the Amsterdam Declaration, given that some countries, I think Italy joined afterwards, so there is room. And Trace has been there doing some assessments showing that the companies that made such commitments, they're still exposed to the same level of deforestation risk. And I'm not saying here that it's, you know, on purpose, we don't care, but tracing that is challenging. And then when I was looking for some visuals, I came across this, which was funny. Clearly, it has nothing to do with deforestation or with the environment, but it has to do with exercising. But yes, I mean, how can you make a commitment without a plan and without putting it into practice? It sounds like that whole thing of, I'll start a diet on Monday, but you don't really get started, with the difference that in that case, if you don't start, it's not you who suffer, it's others. And then your motivation may not be too high. Supply chain transparency is there. I'm not going to take too much time on this because I think most of you already know Trace, and I'm happy to talk more about it. Many of the colleagues here at the SCI work a lot with this kind of traceability tool. And with the time I've got, just some final notes so that you can take them home. Transparency has improved significantly over the past 5 to 10 years. Traceability tools, satellite monitoring capability. So the technology has improved tremendously. But when it comes to the policy and governance that should step up their game to be able to, you know, to innovate and to accompany those capabilities that have improved, we're still falling short. Accountability is a must, as we learned from the previous presentation, but it's still not there because transparency doesn't lead to accountability automatically. We need other things to happen. We have seen, I must acknowledge, some governance initiatives that are more innovative, some groupings of concerned actors on Swedish level, on European level, also in Brazil, such as the Cerrado Working Group, but it needs to go on. And finally, as I always like to remark, we need to engage beyond the chain. If we think of beef or soy, it's not only talking to those specific producers that you will get somewhere. You need to understand those landscapes where you're supplying from as complex systems, both in ecological terms and in human terms when it comes to the social environment, to the politics of it. Sometimes you might get a better result by, let's say, supporting these folks who may be on the front line of the arc of deforestation than by simply trying to convince the vested interests not to deforest. So think of that and keep a systems approach in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Myron. Next up, Beatrice. Karlskrona. It's going to talk on finance. Beatrice is the Executive Director of the Global Economic Dynamics and Biosphere Program at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. So welcome, Beatrice, and you can take one of those.
Det räcker va?
Det räcker.
Hade du en sån där?
There was one before.
Okay, jag står här.
You want to use mine?
No, the clicker thingy me. I'll stand here. I won't be so mobile. It's okay. Hello, everyone. I'm going to give a very brief, don't worry about it, a very brief run through of some research that we have been doing over the course of the last few years. And Alice, who's been doing a lot of it as well, is in the room, so she can help me answer questions. And it's about trying to, what we call, identify sleeping financial giants. So this links quite nicely to the previous talks, because I totally agree that we have focused a lot on the supply chains and the corporate actors in that supply chain, as well as the markets and the niche markets that certification schemes or so have catered to. But the financial actors that support the corporate activities along the entire supply chain of many of these deforestation drivers are also important to engage. So that's what we've been trying to do a little bit. And this is a report I'll show. I'll give you the QR code in the end. But this is a report we put out in September last year, which was geared very much based on our research and geared towards the financial sector to start to think about some of these issues. Now, our take on this, we have not come from the deforestation kind of supply chain perspective. We came at this more from climate stability and tipping points. And we have had sort of two impetus behind this work. One is that the stability of the Earth's climate system depends not only on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, which is the standard debate out there at the moment. And of course, greenhouse gas emissions reductions is fundamentally important. But what's not discussed so much is that there are believed to be certain tipping elements in the planet, regions which, if tipped, could actually escalate global warming quite significantly and quite fast. And forests play a role there. I'm going to show you in just a minute. So the impetus is to actually get onto the agenda the fact that bolstering the resilience of some of these key biomes and regions of the planet is instrumental, and finance has a role to play. The second impetus behind this is, of course, then to identify these financial actors with the power to maybe lead a transformation or at least push us in the right direction fast, because there's a lot of leverage power behind capital, as we all know, at least today's society. I'm just going to show this very quickly. I don't want to get into a lengthy thing about climate stability and tipping points, but just to note that when we talk about this at finance, I often get this comment, yeah, well, these are what the curves look like. Okay, this is from 2013, but it still looks more or less the same in the recent report. And it looks like incremental change, and surely we can adapt to this. So really, what's the big issues we are trying to reduce? And then I borrow from Will Stephan, who's one of the key Earth system scientists behind some of this thinking on tipping elements. And he likes to put, like, let's put this IPCC map in, or curves, in relation to just even 2,000 years back. You see the Roman Empire there. And you see this is what it looks like. So this is not incremental change. We're talking about something fundamentally different from what we have seen before. And that this change in temperature that's projected is fundamentally different and way outside of the natural envelope of variability. What's more is that Earth system scientists believe that somewhere after 2 degrees, and we're already heading well towards 1.5, as you know, unfortunately, but somewhere beyond 2 degrees, maybe up to 4, there are a set of these tipping elements in the Earth system that could be triggered. We don't know exactly where. There's a lot of uncertainty around this. But if they are triggered, that could, as I said, escalate a whole set of domino effects. This is a figure from a paper that came out last year, which made a big splash because in some circles this is, of course, controversial. There are big uncertainties linked to this. But I'm only flashing it here to show you that here are some of the or these are the tipping elements that Earth system science has now identified as probably very likely to exist, and these are the temperatures at which they're very likely to tip or get triggered. Now, 2 points to make with this figure is that, oh, yeah, there we go, is that forests play a major role here. So here is a role for why deforestation starts to become intimately linked to climate issues beyond just the fact that they are a carbon sink. The other thing is that these temperatures, you see the yellow and the red and whatever, they don't account for deforestation. That's also a problem, and I'm going to show you a slide why. I'm not going to get into this because I realize now, after I just threw the slide in, that you're all familiar with this, how the Amazon gets its water and wadi-wadi-ba, and what maintains it, but we all know that it's already, climate change is already affecting this together with deforestation. We've seen large diebacks and we've seen lots of fires as well threatening this particular biome. So what Will and others have put together, and Carlos Nobre is intimately connected to this as well, is the fact that if we look at deforestation and how this links to this tipping dynamic and the Amazon potentially tipping and becoming really a promoter of climate instability rather than instability, is that there's a tipping point around about 40% of original forest covered is clear. But that's if you don't consider climate change. And there is already climate change happening, as you know. If you consider only climate change, then a 3 to 5 degree temperature increase is believed to sort of trigger Amazon tipping into the savanna. But the problem is that both of these are occurring at the same time. And if you put them together, the Paris 2 target would reduce allowable deforestation to around about 25% at the most. And you probably already know this, but in Brazil, we're approaching 20% of original forest cover loss at the moment, which is rather scary. We are close to a potential tipping point here. We don't know exactly where. And if we look at Paris commitments of 3 degrees Celsius, which we really don't want to go there, but just ponder that we were, then that would reduce the allowable deforestation that we would be allowed to have, not to tip this to nearly zero. And clearly we're not on the good trajectory, as you showed in that sense. What was I going to say here? Let me just consult my notes. Well, just that I think the way that we approach this to try and link the financial sector to this is we picked these 2 forest biomes, the boreal forest and the Amazon, because these were economic activities to which you can clearly link the financial sector. You can't necessarily link the financial sector to melting Arctic ice sheets, for example. It's too indirect. But when it comes to forests, there are very clear economic sectors that you can actually start with. And what we did was a very kind of simple and straightforward method, which was looking at the key economic sectors that are driving this, soy and beef being 2 of them, but I know it's not the only one. Then looking at the key economic actors, and in fact, we have used and relied very largely on trace data as well. And then looking at, there's enormous consolidation in these segments in the initial, in the traders in this section, as you know. So, and then we took some of those key economic actors and we've tried to trace the financial resources that they are relying on, starting with equity as this first stage, because debt is very, very difficult to get your hands on. That means loans, corporate loans. And we've come up with a set of investors. We were doing this to try and see, are there some financial actors that are basically ubiquitous in all of these forest regions? So we weren't just focusing on the Amazon. We wanted to have sort of keystone actors, we've called them in other sectors in the fishing industry. We wanted to see if there were keystone financial actors that, by virtue of changing how they do things, could also have a trickle-down effect quite fast in multiple different domains. And so we came up with this list of 15. I'm not going to bother showing you them because the thing with this is that while some of them stay the same, there's turnover, of course, in where they invest and so in their portfolio. So the 15 in and of themselves are not that interesting. But what I can say is that even if we redid this analysis today, 2 years later, you would have some of the really big investors would be more or less the same. And among them are the 3 to 5 large passive investors in the US. So like the Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, and so on. And we can talk more about how, if we could get those kinds of actors involved, what difference that could make. But they're very tricky to get to. So when we then the message that we've tried to put to this sector from our research has been, okay, Earth system tipping points represent major systemic risks for the financial sector. Should we get this cascading effect? That's not just an issue for forests locally in Brazil or elsewhere. This is a systemic issue that will escalate global warming and has systemic effects for the entire financial sector, especially for many of these actors that are so-called universal owners, which means that they're invested not just in one sector, but in the entire economies through their portfolios. And that climate change mitigation is about greenhouse gas emissions reduction, yes, but also building resilience of these key ecosystems and processes to buffer already ongoing change and to prevent them from tipping, and particularly in these forested domains and in the Amazon. And the way that we've engaged so far is we've taken this kind of thinking and tried to have dialogues with the financial sector. We ran one in Stockholm in June 2017, where we had a lot of the Swedish actors like AP-fonderna and the Swedish Church, but also some of the big banks in Europe like HSBC and a few others. A year later, when our research was a little bit more mature, we presented this in London. We ran a similar dialogue together with UNPRI at their London offices with all, or not all, say like 30 of their signatories, to also get them to think about, okay, what can we do with this? And then most recently, about 2 weeks ago, we ran a similar dialogue focusing on the Asian investment sectors in Tokyo. And at the moment, I would say that the focus has really been on just trying to transfer some knowledge to up the understanding and increasing the awareness of these kind of nonlinear dynamics for the financial sector, and also to link for them deforestation issues to climate issues, which are not linked as far as they are concerned and how they think about these issues today, I would say, at least the broad majority. There is still a gap and lots to be done when it comes to now, yeah, I'm finishing, this is the last one. When it comes to saying, right, what do we do about this? And how do you take this kind of understanding, this kind of knowledge, and actually make it into something that's going to change something on the ground? And that's a space that I think we're doing some work on that, but it's a big space to be filled, to translate this knowledge into, as I said, something that's directly usable for asset managers on a day-to-day basis when they go to screen where they are to allocate their resources and how to assess investment opportunities. And I think that's maybe linked to some of the talks that I heard earlier today about it becomes very tangible. What kinds of forest policies should you be promoting to the asset managers when they go to TIC, or how they should engage with corporate boards? Because a lot of this happens through engagement with boards. What kinds of afforestation, what kinds of deforestation, reforestation, and what? And all these nitty-gritty details that we personally, I don't have that knowledge. But that, I think, is very much the next step. And of course, without traceability, none of this is really going to be feasible either, because financial actors don't have the resources to go and check on the ground. They rely to a large extent on accountability, benchmarking, and traceability, and be able to trust that via certification being just one. So I'll stop there. And if you're interested, you'll see the webpage there and the report with the QR, which you can just download.
Thank you very much, Beatrice.
Thank you.
So we have one final presentation before the group discussions. Anna Kärvar, who's seconded from SIDA as a forestry officer at FAO. Before you take the floor, while you set up the presentation, Maria will give the floor to Toby Gardner for 1 minute to say a word on trace. Toby, who's with Stockholm Environment.
Good afternoon, everyone. I really regret that I couldn't join you today. We had I had a long-standing competing agenda, but just building on what Myron was saying and linking to the end of Bear's presentation, to give people a bit of an update. Trace is now moving into a second phase. Trace is a supply chain transparency information platform that Myron was referring to. And just so you have an idea what we're doing, we started in Brazilian soy, and we've been working on that extensively for the last few years. And we've got 3 pillars to our new strategy. with funding from the Norwegian government and the Moore Foundation. And one is extrapolating trace to new contexts, particularly soy in Latin America and other countries, in Argentina, in Paraguay, also beef in Paraguay and in Brazil, and also palm oil in Indonesia, and quite a few other commodities, including shrimp, probably in Indonesia and Ecuador. The second pillar is to be developing the platform in many more ways to make it more accessible and to make it more relevant and more useful. So feedback on how you may, if you are and have or intend to use trace, is always very welcome. And the third pillar is doing a lot more analysis and curation and research on those data, both ourselves and with partners. So another pitch is, if you do have ideas and interests about ways in which you might want to use trace data, then of course do get in touch with us. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Toby. Anna, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Anna Sharvar, and I'm been seconded from SIDA to Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, since nearly 3 years back. And I'm working in the RED Plus program, and thank you for got the opportunity to brief present what we are doing at FAO. So I would like to show how agroforestry and RED Plus can reduce the deforestation and improve livelihoods. So, as mentioned before, drivers of deforestation, agriculture is a main driver, and how to address this. And the Paris Agreement is not only about greenhouse gas emissions from and to reduce the temperature. It's also to secure food security and agriculture production when climate change occur. And in the national determined contributions that was mentioned before, in the tropical countries, 85% mention agriculture and land use change and forestry as one of their measure to in their NDCs. And also in the SDGs, it's very central from FAO's perspective to end hunger, Objective 2, and also 13, 15. And some of them FAO is directly responsible to report on as well. So in the agriculture and forestry nexus, because as I have as a title, you must think also outside the forest to come to the key problem here. So it's you have to increase or maintain forest cover, but also to secure food security. So it's a combine there where you have to find allies in a land use planning or landscape approach. And also agroforestry, we are investigating now how we can combine agroforestry and RED Plus. And in the RED Plus strategies, agroforestry is often a component that is one of the solutions, even if agroforestry's role is twofold, depending on the definition, if it's forest or not. And in the NDCs, more than 40% explicitly mentioned agroforestry as one of their contribution. Just a refreshment of your minds. RED Plus is stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and then the plus is sustainable management of forests and conservation and enhancement of forest and carbon stocks. So first it was RED, and then it was RED Plus, and it's been an ongoing program since 10 years back. So last year it was a celebration for REDD+. And it's also studies done what has been achieved during this 10-year period. And yes, to make it very brief, the expectation was very high, and we in somewhere between. But I still think REDD+ can play an important role in this work. Yes, here is. Oh, there it was ready. It's more to say that REDD+, it's under the UNFCCC, and then it's different components that is, so it's 4 pillars in the REDD+ program. So the countries has to got these pillars in their REDD+. So it must be a REDD national strategy. It's about safeguards, national forest monitoring system, or forest reference emission level. And in the beginning of this period, it was mostly in the readiness phase. And now many countries are moving into implementation. And then it's going to be more exciting, I think. Then you come to more operation. And few are also achieving into a result-based actions. Yes, this is that where FAO works in a REDD+ perspective. So the countries that is working with REDD+ can be even bigger because this is from a FAO perspective. And the REDD+, the UN REDD program that started first was the 3 UN agencies, FAO, UNDP or UNEP. And now REDD+ can be a donor combined by the JF and also Green Climate Fund, and it's a combination by different funding and forest carbon partnership and so it's a more conglomerate funding. And to identify win-win solutions, agriculture, forestry, FAO in the as Emily mentioned before, the Commission of Forests. So 2016, the theme for this year was to find agriculture and forestry working hand in hand to find the solutions. But and after that, now I'm working in a study, I should say, to find such solutions on a case from different countries. So, for example, Côte d'Ivoire, there you have more data-driven combinations to get a better knowledge of land use, both from agriculture and forestry side, to set into in the position of climate change. So it can also be it should be said that the REDD+ also achieved a lot of capacity building in countries as such. And for Ghana, the Cocoa Forest REDD+ program is in a line with the NDCs, the REDD+ strategy, and it's incorporated because the deforestation is very high, it's 2% in the countries, and the cocoa production stands for 1/3 of the export. So it's a very important commodity. So this is also an initiative where the private sector is involved from Ghana. So, and Rwanda, I mentioned it for the agroforestry. They, in their plan, forest investment program, they will plant 3/3, more than 75% in the country will be planted by trees, agroforestry mainly, and it's a very ambitious objective to set. So agroforestry is an important part for land restoration there. And this is more to show that in a wider perspective, FAO is also working in more that being raised here also with communities and tenure, more private sector engagement. So it's broader than the area I presented here. And increasingly, REDD+ actions is very connected to the NDCs, the country's NDCs. Yes. Yes, future, it will be more cross-sectorial to identify solutions where a combination from food security and forest cover. So it's my main message. Yes, thank you. And further information on our website. I also put some brochures on the back where you can see more what we are doing, and so thank you.
People can contact you also for more.
Yes, sure, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ja, visst.
Yes, before the group instruction.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, sure.
I just want to thank a few people, the live audience for being with us. We will go into group discussions, but connect with us and we will share the outcomes of the groups. And after each presentation, I should have thanked the speakers with some nice chocolate. So you can come up here and you can share with the group if you want to have friends. There will be a fika in the afternoon as well. And before I hand over to Martin, we are a bit behind, but I have promised, because there are many different initiatives going on that you can discuss more in the groups, but I promised one initiative, 1 minute, the soy dialogue in Sweden. So we will show one of the slides.
To come up here?
Yeah,
Yes.
sure. Ian, are we still? Okay, we're still there.
We're still on air.
Okay. So 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Hanna Skog. I work for an organization called Axe Foundation. And for you that doesn't know us, we're an independent non-profit organization working with initiatives and projects to accelerate innovations and projects on sustainability. We also are the coordinators of the Swedish Soy Dialogue, which is an initiative that was founded in 2012 by WWF, Lantmännen, Arla, Axfood, among a couple of other organizations. WWF has been the coordinator up until last year when we took over the responsibility to lead the work with the Swedish Soy Dialogue. And the dialogue is a cross-industry collaboration between Swedish feed companies, Swedish food producing companies, Swedish retailers and association organizations. The network was started for two reasons, both to highlight the connection between the problems of soy production and Swedish food production and consumption, but also to contribute to the development of sustainable produced soy. There are other similar initiatives in other European countries, but the Swedish Soy Dialogue is, as of today at least, the most shining star that has come the furthest. Today, the network consists of approximately 50 companies and organizations. You see them here on the map, so it includes all the big retailers, the big dairy companies, the big feed companies, and so on. And all these companies are doing a commitment when joining the network, and the commitment, by signing the commitment, the members ensure that all soy that has been used directly or indirectly, which means through the soy feed given to animal for meat and dairy products, is sustainably produced. The commitment includes both animal products, but also food products for human consumption, including soy. And today the commitment covers the company's private labels, and it's 100% voluntary. The network meets 2 times a year, both to learn from each other, but also to contribute and collaborate on the issues concerning soy. And yeah, so very shortly, this is an example of how the private sector is collaborating on the soys around the issues around soy today. And of course, as of today, it's first and foremost a business network, but we are really keen on collaborating with you guys, and I look forward to the dialogue, the group dialogues now. And also we have a website, which is sojadialogen.se, if you want to read more. And also I'm here during the group discussions, so if you have further questions, I'm available.
Thank you very much, Anna. Okay, now we got plenty food for thought from all these presentations. So the idea now is to bring that to our group discussions, where we'll try to focus on this question. So what steps can Swedish actors take to reduce deforestation? And if you come up with a lot of good suggestions, then feel free to also think about sort of, okay, why isn't this happening? What's the big sort of bottlenecks or challenges we're facing in order to step up actions? And what could we potentially do to try to get through that or get over that? We're, as Maria said, we're a bit behind schedule. So I suggest that when we start